bring attention to contemporary and historical issues that Indigenous peoples face, again with an emphasis on the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women. And I do think what is really central for your work is really your belief, which I think is very apt for an institution of higher education, that learning is really an ever-evolving process, and that it can really be transformative at any stage of life, and especially if it means bringing energy back into the community. So, without even further ado, please welcome me and join me in welcoming our speaker, Michelle Brown. Welcome.
Thank you, Thomas, so much for that introduction. I see something on the screen, so I'm like, I don't know if I need this or not, but I'm just in backup. I'm going to put it right here, just in case we're not able to get this presentation up on the wall. Have that there handy to guide me.
In case you want the presentation on here, if you want to just have a look.
To follow along.
It's just
Okay.
that people won't be able to see it. Yeah.
That'll be easier. Well, yat everyone. Like Thomas said, I am Dene or Navajo and part of the Water Flows Together clan. And so, gosh, a little bit about myself. I'm originally from Anchorage, Alaska, which is quite far from here. And my father is from the Two Gray Hills, New Mexico reservation. And what's really cool about that is that I've been able to live on his land as well as in urban settings back home in Anchorage, and kind of getting to have a glimpse into these two very different worlds. One being the reservation, which is like set apart in the middle of nowhere. Like it's kind of for, I guess, placement context in between like Shiprock, New Mexico and Farmington, New Mexico. So in between there is the Two Gray Hills, New Mexico reservation. My grandmother, his mom, is a weaver, so she made Two Gray Hills rugs. And so getting insight to what that life is like in the reservation setting, and then my contemporary life back home in Anchorage, I would kind of bounce back and forth between those two spaces. And I had the opportunity to live on that land where, I feel like I live very much like my father did, in the sense that there's like no electricity to this day, no running water to this day. And so it's a very humbling experience for me when I would go back home to Anchorage and have all of those types of amenities that aren't available to some people who live on the reservation. I know in the past couple of years there's been infrastructure to bring more electricity and flowing water into those spaces, but we have not yet been recipients of that in our space. So what brought me to working in this type of more, I hate to say activist, because I feel like there's a lot broader terms for that with more meaning. But what brought me into this space, really being Navajo and being indigenous to this land, was, wanting to do more. And I became aware of murdered and missing indigenous peoples issues over the past few years. The movement largely started in Canada and then migrated to the US because we share the same space. These are really places where they are colonized borders, where these are not spaces where we had drawn lines as indigenous peoples. So these are issues that we share across borders, whether it's through Canada or through Mexico, which technically Utah used to be Mexico, if you guys want to look into that. But so knowing all of these issues existing and being aware of it, it wasn't until 2018 that I became way more involved with the work and decided to actually do something about it. So as Thomas mentioned, I have a design background. I attended the New School in New York City for fashion design because that was my passion. So I went from all the way West Coast to all the way East Coast. And then I came here because I was expecting a baby. And I was not going to live in the middle of New York City with a little one. But what happened when I got here was that I learned that my nephew's mother had been found murdered in Flagstaff, Arizona. And she's also from my tribe. She's Dene as well. And it wasn't until that happened that it really came close enough to touch my life that I realized I needed to do something more than just be aware and start educating myself further. Looks like IT is here to hopefully save the day. To do something more. I felt such a weight and a heaviness from knowing that someone in my family, someone who has been in my life, not for so long, but long enough to really make an impact on me, I decided that I wanted to not only learn about it, I wanted to do something in the community that would hopefully make change along with many others. About 5 years ago now was the first day that was set apart as National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples. And so social media helped educate me in the beginning for a large portion of the things that I didn't know already that weren't readily available online, like following accounts with links that, connected to the data that we do have. And I saw there was an event that was going to be happening in downtown Salt Lake. I hadn't even been here for a year at this point, and I decided that I was just going to show up at this Day of Remembrance event and learn more. So that's really where I started to connect with the larger community and happened upon an organization called PANDOS, which stands for People Organizing Native Dialogue and Organizing Support. And they had a small, very just grassroots-based volunteer group, and I decided to just start showing up to their monthly meetings and to see where I could help out in any ways from a volunteer standpoint. Later on down the line, I ended up becoming the chair of this organization and learned so much along the way. And it's really, I've heard some really difficult stories from many community members from many different tribes. We have 8 tribes in the state of Utah. And each one has been touched in some way. Many families have been touched in some way by the violence that affects Indigenous peoples. And we largely focus just on the state of Utah, just because that is our local area. There are many other states that do have different branches of MMIW or MMIR, which is Murdered Missing Indigenous Relatives, because I do want to mention that this violence also affects men and boys too. It's just that the demographics in terms of the violence affects women and girls at more higher rates than men and boys. And it looks like we also have this set up. Very lovely. So I will hop back over here, and I may have I'm going to skip through probably some of this because I mentioned it already, and that's just PANDOS. These lovely people here are also part of PANDOS. And so I'll just go ahead and read our mission statement too, just so you guys can kind of further see what our mission is. We're mothers, sisters, fathers, brothers, and imperfect humans advocating for missing and murdered Indigenous women and people. We strive to disrupt colonial paradigms and structures of gender oppression by providing education, space for healing, community organizing, and interconnection. We amplify the voices of the silenced by empowering Indigenous women and suppressed communities. We share their stories to honor those who have been murdered, missing, and suffered injustice. We believe justice originates from engaged communities coming together across the boundaries of Indigenous and settler nations alike. So, jumping right into it, when I speak to people or when people find out about this issue for the very first time, they're like, how long has this been happening? Why is this an issue? And so first and foremost, what I tell students or members of the public is just, you need to educate yourself and understand the history of this issue, because it didn't just come out of nowhere. This didn't just start all of the sudden. It's just that attention has been brought to it in a broader light, and I feel like the media has been reporting on it a little bit better in the most recent years. But let's get into where all of this started, really. And that starts with pre-colonization. We really have to talk about the pre-colonized Turtle Island, as we Indigenous people call it. And, the belief system here was completely different from when settlers came in. And this is not something, I just want to put a disclaimer, this is something that when people are ignorant of this issue, I can't hold this against them at all that they don't know. Largely, the United States and the education system from a public school level doesn't teach this to students. You don't learn about this in like middle school, high school, elementary. Like, it's not talked about in this way. We talk and focus largely on other parts of the making of the United States, but we don't really talk about pre-colonization from that standpoint and moving forward. So for Indigenous beliefs, there's over 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States, and each tribe has different creation stories, belief systems. It's very rich in diversity in terms of like creation stories or how we see the world. But primarily, Earth is our first mother, and that women are literally just connected to the land and to the water itself, and no distinction of seeing oneself different from the land, which you can start to see where there's a lot of issues in terms of the belief systems of colonizers versus Indigenous beliefs start to take shape. So when settlers first came here, it was really with the belief that they were entitled to the land that they were coming to. So this is a distinct type of colonialism that focuses on replacing the Indigenous population with their own settler society, and that over time it develops a distinctive identity and sovereignty, which is now what we know as the United States, and what it means to be an American. That is what white settler colonialism has produced in this country, at least. A lot of settlers came here with the concept of manifest destiny, which is essentially this idea that this is justified whether through political or religious expectations, that this is just meant to be. It's there, and because we can make it there, then it's ours. That this land is free for us. If we can take it, then it's ours. And then nationalism, which is, of course, an extreme form of patriotic feelings, principles, and efforts, especially marked by a feeling of superiority over other countries or cultures. And for context, settlers did have a higher form of technology, and especially when it came to, tools and, guns that were brought here, it was very easy for them to feel superior because they then realized they had the power to take from Indigenous peoples. Just as an overview, you can kind of see a visual here, which represents the land cessions that happened here in the United States. And this is the concept of selling land, which we talked a little bit about how the belief system of many Indigenous peoples was that they weren't separate from the land. They saw themselves as a part of that. So this is a completely different concept that you could even sell land. A lot of Indigenous societies really functioned on trade and reciprocity. Instead of selling things, it was a trade for things or reciprocated with, some other form of currency in terms of like an object or an act that you could do. And so the concept of selling land was very new for Indigenous peoples. There's also the Dawes Act of 1887 that happened, and that's essentially where the United States, as it started to form more power in different parts of the United States, sold Indigenous land, and a lot of times that involved tricking or overpowering the Indigenous nation in order to claim more of their land and supply it to white settlers. I also touch here on the myth of untouched wilderness. We have a lot of national parks here in the United States, and here in Utah we have some really beautiful ones. But there's this idea that it's wilderness untouched, where we start to forget, or it's marketed to us as if no one has seen these spaces or no one has inhabited these spaces, which we know that that's not true. Indigenous people had been here for time immemorial. And so these are not true wildernesses. This is a space that was the home of Indigenous peoples, where they had really cultivated the land in benefit to them and their families. Of course, there's the forced removal from homelands where, whether through treaties that were broken or whether it was just outright displacement of different tribal peoples, they were taken away from the spaces which they had learned to fish, hunt, and cultivate the land that they had been on. And so when you take people away from their medicinal knowledge of the local plants in their area or the animals that they were used to hunting, the water sources where they were used to getting water from, it really displaces them in a way that they have to learn how to survive in whole new means. Relocation was not something that was easy. Indigenous peoples fought back to maintain their land and to stay. So you can start to imagine the type of violence that it took to move these people out from the homelands and put them into spaces that were less sellable for white settlers. Being relocated really meant, losing family members to violence and to be left with very little resources. As time went on, there was actual displacement in the form of residential schools, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But I want to point out that reservation land is like the least wanted land in the United States. So some of the effects that we've seen of colonialism affects many different aspects of life. So we know that the oil, fracking, drilling, and mining industries have been really disruptive because majority of this work occurs near or on reservation lands, which results in pollution to the soil, to the air, and ultimately affecting Indigenous peoples' higher rates in terms of reproductive health or just overall health. There's higher cancer rates near these types of sites and other diseases. Forced sterilizations impacting Indigenous peoples from the 1960s to the 1970s, where Indigenous women would go in for an appointment for reproductive help. You could imagine just going into the gynecologist and leaving sterilized without your consent. Man camps and human sex trafficking also occurring near reservation sites. That goes really hand in hand with the oil, drilling, and fracking and mining industries, because you're bringing in a whole new workforce into spaces where Indigenous people live, and these are people who don't technically have ties to the community, and people may not know who they are, and they can very easily get away with things that would not be typical for someone who is known in the community. Residential schools is another one. Sorry, I keep on skipping forward. Residential schools is a big one too, where starting with the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania being the first one in the United States, where Indigenous children were taken from their families. Again, this is not something that happened passively. Indigenous peoples really tried to keep their children with them, and the children were either taken by force or families were threatened with like food rations being taken away or being moved to other sites. You could be arrested or incarcerated or just killed if you did not comply. So that was something that really impacted many Indigenous tribes, and it still has impacts today. So that leads us into murdered and missing Indigenous people. And what happens when a loved one goes missing or is found murdered. So Obviously, this is like a synopsis of much larger issues that, of course, when you walk away today, like I would hope that you research this a little bit more on your own to understand, because there's so much information to go through. But essentially, as a population, we've suffered a lot of trauma. We've suffered a lot of setbacks in terms of education, ability to afford like housing, food, and other aspects of life that would make it easier for us. But essentially, like there's a historical context which you have to understand that leads to this issue now. And there's not a lot of infrastructure per tribe of like what to do when people go missing or are found murdered. So I do want to highlight that as well. And so this is really something that we're still trying to find remedies for. So important things to know as we start to go into this a little bit deeper is that there's jurisdictional issues. So each nation, each tribe has its own sovereign nation within the United States, so they have their own tribal governments. What can happen here is that you can fall into jurisdictional issues between, the federal police force or FBI or the local tribe and their police force and how investigations are held. The ability for tribes to prosecute non-natives on reservations is still pending. And what that means is that essentially if you're a non-native who goes onto native land, which is its own sovereign state, and you commit a crime, reservation police, or let's say it's my nation, Navajo Nation, if you're a non-Navajo person who goes onto Navajo land and you commit a crime, there's no way currently that they can prosecute you for the crime you commit unless it is a federal crime like kidnapping, rape, or murder. So as long as you are able to leave, they can't hold you for anything because you're not Navajo, essentially. And that's something that's being worked on right now. And hopefully, the law takes so long to change. And so this is something that several agencies have been working on, but that's currently pending right now, the ability to prosecute non-natives on native land. Native women are murdered up to 10 times the national average. That is exorbitantly high. Murder is also the third leading cause of death for Native women, and 1 in 3 Native American are raped during their lifetimes, and 2.5 times the likelihood for an average American woman. 86% of these cases, the assailant is non-Native, and there's currently no database to record human trafficking of Indigenous women federally or in Utah. So what do we know about the issue and why does it persist? So essentially, what we do know is that we need to collect more data. Essentially, because there are no databases to pull from currently, we, along with others, have decided that a task force was needed. So the state of Utah had been talking about doing a task force for this for a long time. And just a few years ago, I want to say it's 2.5 years ago now, a task force was formed. And what they largely did was collect data from the state of Utah in different listening sessions around the state. So Bluff, Utah, one here in Salt Lake City, they had one in Ogden. So they essentially invited members of the community, the Indigenous community, to come and tell their stories, essentially, and collect their stories from the public. And they also worked along with law enforcement to hear about cold cases that were happening in the state and things that they may have missed. And they found a lot. They're supposed to be actually wrapping up their report, I believe, on November 14th. And so the scope of this task force is to really help find paths forward to remedy these types of issues and to seek out prevention. And then I just want to be cognizant of time too. I don't have a clock in front of me, so I just want to know how I'm doing on time. Okay. Okay.
About 35 moments.
Okay, and then we'll start the film, or in total? Total, okay. I am going to just continue onward really quickly. So what the task force has done also is reporting on their research process and methods that they want to go through. This includes reporting initial investigations on missing persons cases, communication and possible alert systems. And then I mentioned cold cases as well. They want proper death investigations because they're jurisdictional issues. They want more collaboration between agencies, essentially, to lead towards data collection. There's also victim and family services, because even if you aren't someone who's been found murdered, if you are a victim of violence, there's not a lot of access to victim services on or near reservations. Of course, we want to have prevention, and then we need to work on media reporting. This goes into it a little bit further, just outlining like gaps in communication. And then other things that might be needed in terms of trauma-informed and victim-centered practices. I want to move forward just in terms of time. Oh, here we go. So there's something I'm really passionate about is just media portrayal of MMIW people. And so we know largely in culture, there's a lot of perpetuated stereotypes about Indigenous peoples. There's a lot of negative portrayals we've seen, like whether it's cartoons, movies, media, and overall less coverage on murdered and missing Indigenous people cases. I just put this together to show, this is my nephew's mother. This is how her picture was depicted in the story of her being found. Her body being found. And essentially it's a mugshot. That's the first image that people associated with her is, oh, this person's, been arrested. This person's done something. But this is how they chose to depict her rather than reaching out to the family and getting a proper photo of her. And so you can start to imagine what someone's perception of a victim can be right off the bat based off of this media reporting. It's definitely something where we should see media sensitivity training, especially in terms of murdered and missing Indigenous peoples, knowing that that the demographic is more susceptible to violence, and depicting someone this way is not the same. So I'm going to relate this back to a case that we all largely saw and heard of the past couple of years, and I'm not relating this just because it's another woman who's murdered, but I in no way think that it's okay that violence is being perpetrated against anyone, but it's hard not to compare the case of Gabby Petito and the widespread media attention that she gained versus an Indigenous woman. I would also ask, when is the last time you've heard a sensationalized news story of an Indigenous woman getting justice, either being a victim of violence or being found murdered? So you can see just even the difference in the photos of them being depicted differently. And there was so much media coverage for Gabby Petito's case. I also want to note that, within the first week, there was $1.2 million towards search efforts for Gabby Petito. If you guys ever heard of the case of the missing Indigenous woman, Kayla Blackbird, here in Salt Lake City, the reward for her, for any information leading to her disappearance, was only $200. So I'm just putting a comparison even from a dollar amount here of just search efforts and the type of investment that is put into different peoples. So I just wanted to make that quick comparison. What can the media do to improve the reporting? They can understand how to interact with Indigenous peoples from a more respective standpoint. They can also ensure that they're sustaining and covering headlines about Indigenous missing people more effectively. With the Gabby Petito case, like, they covered the story until she was found. They covered the story till they found out what happened. And we don't see the same type of investment for Indigenous peoples. This is, again, just some information from the task force and how they see media reporting for the state of Utah, and approaches they feel will be a little bit more effective. I want to highlight that reporting of victims' race and tribal affiliation would become important. Sometimes in these cases, Indigenous peoples are misrepresented in sense of, in the police report, the police would put a Latino female or an Asian female instead of actually finding out what their race is. So then you can see how that eventually skews the data that they have. The next thing I want to highlight is just what you can do in your own community. First of all, thank you for being here and taking your time to learn more about this issue. We made this list in our group, 8 things to say instead of silence on this issue, is to understand the history, because that's something you can share with others as well, reflecting on how you fit into this and what you can do. Sharing emotional labor by creating space, and what that means in an example is not just to rely on Indigenous people to only teach you about these issues, but independently looking up these issues on your own. And if you have questions, of course, like, ask, but also just like create that space for yourself to educate yourself on these issues. Sharing information, which social media has been really great for that, on educating others en masse. Hold legislators accountable. And what that means is, if there's any chance you get to vote on legislation that supports like Indigenous rights, that's a way to help give Indigenous people back the power, and to ensure there's laws that are in their favor. And then showing up, like you guys showing up today. I'm really grateful for that. Inviting others. And then 8th, practice being uncomfortable. Some of these conversations are really uncomfortable, especially for someone who's learning for the first time and just feeling like they're overwhelmed. So those are some of the things that you can do. I just also want to, before we show the film, give a little bit of background. So one of the filmmakers, both of them are from Salt Lake Community College, and so they decided to do this film once the head filmmaker found out that this issue existed. He wanted to do a bit more, so as part of his senior thesis, he started researching along with his producers and wanted to create something to create community awareness. And so this is just a first part of what they hope to be a series of a documentary that goes around the state of Utah and asking the 8 different tribes their MMIR stories. And so I'm really grateful to them for allowing us permission to screen it here today. And I'm just really grateful that you guys are here. And Thomas, did we have time for questions after the film? Yeah.
So unfortunately, so apologies again about the whole AV disaster. So I do think, unfortunately, that kind of cut into the question time. But I mean, Michelle, if you don't mind, so probably we're going to just go about, if we start the movie now, like 3-4 minutes over. Obviously, you have to leave, right? You have to leave. But if you want to stick around after, I'm sure Michelle will be happy to answer any questions that people might have. Yeah, sorry about that. But I think, unfortunately, we won't have time for a whole official Q&A. But before we show the movie, let's thank our speaker again.